What are the teachings of Buddhism? Is it a religion or just a philosophy? Can Christians believe in it? Can they believe in karma? Are any of the Buddhist tenets compatible with theism or even Christianity? Could thinking through Buddhism actually help someone arrive at believing in a God? We're going to be talking about all of that and much more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. Theology on Air is an offshoot of Theology on Tap, a ministry to young adults in Houston, where we drink delicious beer and we talk about interesting things around philosophy, theology, faith and culture. And then here at the podcast, we get to dive in even more deeply and pick people's brains like Tyler. But I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC here in Houston. I'm joined by Evan McClanahan, Senior and only pastor at First Lutheran here in Midtown.
I'm also the associate pastor.
Yeah, you're the everything. You're also like the janitor sometimes. Yeah, electrician, plumber.
Right.
He's a jack of all trades, but he also knows his Bible. And our guest today is Tyler McNabb. Tyler is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of St. Joseph, Macau. He's joining us from several hours ahead. So it's 9 o'clock a.m. here and it's 11 something there. Yikes. He is author of Religious Epistemology, co-author of Plantingian Religious Epistemology and World Religions, and co-editor of Debating Christian Religious Epistemology. He has a book coming out that we're going to be talking about some today, but welcome, Tyler. So glad to have you.
It's good to talk with you. It's been some time, and good to meet you for the first time.
Indeed.
But funny enough, I just happen to have a Houston Rockets shirt on, so I feel like I'm back in Houston for a second. Yeah.
Are the Houston Rockets still popular in China, given Yao Ming and all of that?
Oh yeah.
No, it went down. The popularity went down. Yeah.
Oh really? Did it really?
Yeah. And that here, I think the biggest team by far is the Lakers. Yao Ming was here today though in Macau.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Did he stand out in a crowd? Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
No, you're fine. This is basketball talk, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
It's a sport with an orange ball. Yeah.
Okay. So do you speak, is the language there Cantonese? Is that the main language in Macau?
Yeah.
Do you speak any? Can you do the whole interview in Cantonese?
Absolutely not. No.
Like two people would know what you were saying, but still.
My wife is trying to learn Cantonese and teach it to our children. And our children in like August will be going to school where it'll be taught in English, but like all the kids will be speaking Cantonese, when class isn't in session. So we'll be getting immersed soon.
Yeah.
My university lectures only in English, so I'm
okay.
I'm okay in that regard. But I'm trying to pick up on some things.
Cool. Well, I would love to pick your brain more about foods you're eating, but today we're here to talk about theology.
McDonald's. That's what I mean.
Stop with that.
And KFC.
That's amazing. Okay, so before we get into all the theology nerdy stuff, tell people, if people don't remember you from when you were at Theology on Tap, tell people just a little bit about you, as much as you feel comfortable telling us about your own kind of journey of faith. What brought you to be interested in all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I've been married for 13 years this month.
Nice.
Whereas I had to kind of, figure out what month I'm in and so forth. But and have 5 children. So Eden, Elijah, Ezra, Eva Maria, and Ezekiel. Right? So we're Catholic, big Catholic family, right?
I figured it was that or Mormon. So.
So in high school, when I was a senior in high school, I had this kind of short agnostic stage where actually I was on the verge of becoming an atheist, and not just like any sort of atheist, but I was about to endorse like nihilism, straight on Nietzsche sort of atheism. And I ended up having a religious experience, and God revealed himself to me. And long story short, started evangelizing a couple of weeks or 2 months later, started doing street evangelism. And when I started doing street evangelism, I realized that, hey, I need to figure out how to communicate and talk with anyone who I meet, right? I want to be able to help bring them to Jesus no matter where they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're an atheist philosophy professor or a devout person of another religious tradition, or whatever. I want to be able to meet them where they're at and help them find Jesus. And so, so that kind of got my interest into religious traditions. And I primarily have worked in something called epistemology, so the study of knowledge, but specifically doing something called religious epistemology, right?
Yeah.
So most of my time I've spent answering questions about how we can know that God exists and how belief in God can be rational.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I've still have kept this interest in other religious traditions, and even seeing if my sort of religious epistemology is compatible with other religious traditions. But all this to say, I was lecturing. I had a comparative philosophy class when I was teaching at HBU, and as I was lecturing, I was like, well, you know what? Like, if you understand Buddhism in this way, to my class saying this, I was like, this actually seems compatible with theism. And sort of a light bulb, was going off, and I started lecturing on this idea. And then, when a research position at the University of Macau opened up, they were like, you need to pitch a project to us. So I was like, oh, well, hey, the other day I was thinking about this, so why not this? And so that's how the book began. I ended up getting hired at a different university full time. I nonetheless still finished the book and wrote it. And my co-author can't be here with me today, unfortunately. Yeah. Eric Baldwin. We've done a lot of co-authoring, and he's awesome. He's great. He's unfortunately he's like probably more knowledgeable in some of the finer aspects of Buddhist philosophy, but nonetheless, still know a bit, and so hopefully I can be of service today.
Yeah, no, I'm excited, and I think Buddhism is one of those things that everybody thinks they know what it is, and then you start talking, and everyone knows a few things. They know the word Zen, they know there's meditation, monks that wear some orange, then they do that thing with the sand sometimes, and there's karma and something about the ocean waves when you die. I mean, but I don't know that everybody actually knows much about, there's like 7 somethings. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Anyway, we'll get to that, but tell us just, so we're going to be talking about Buddhism, but tell us first, because you're going to be talking about how it maybe dovetails or points to, or could lead to classic theism. So let's define some terms first. I mean, we have some theology nerds that listen and they know what that means, but for those people that are like, what are you talking about? What is classical theism?
Yeah, so this is actually a really important point too, because if you just say theism, then a lot of what I'm going to say actually isn't going to follow, and a lot of what I'm going to say won't be compatible with Buddhism at all. So it's specifically a type of theism that's compatible, right? It's the theism that was, say, defended by St. Thomas Aquinas, right? By the early Reformed theologians. It's by St. Augustine, etc. When I say classical theism, I'm going to contrast this with what's called neo-classical theism, or theistic personalism.
We're actually going to be doing a series of podcasts on this later this year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Getting some HBU professors on board with that. But keep going. This is great.
Yeah. So the difference is theistic personalism is kind of like the view where God is mutable. So God changes. Mm-hmm. He can still be immutable in a really weak sense, where he's good, faithful, and he's going to stay faithful and good, tomorrow and the next day. But the idea is that there is genuine change in God. There's genuine potentiality in God, and that he is passible. We can, bring about change in God. We can cause God to suffer, right? There's different ways to understand passibility, but nonetheless, that's the general idea. And that God is complex. He's made up of parts. He's made up of various properties. So you would say God has omniscience, right? That's a property. God has goodness, that's a property, right? This is to be contrasted, however, with classical theism, which basically just denies these things.
Yeah.
So God is actually metaphysically simple.
Yeah.
God is not made up of parts. Why it seems like God has various parts, right? When we say God's omnibenevolent and omniscient, really his knowledge is the same thing as his goodness, which is just the same thing as his power, which just is the same thing as his existence. God is identical to existence itself, right? To his existence. So properties are kind of shorthand descriptions, right? Shorthand ways of talking about the same thing, namely that God is. God is immutable. There's no potentiality in God whatsoever. So think about like the Aristotelian proof that Thomas Aquinas defends, right? The first way. God is pure actuality. Literally, there is no change in him. There's no potential to change. He's completely, wholeheartedly immutable. God is impassible. So given that God has no potentiality, God lacks potentiality, right? We can't cause change in God. We can't move upon God. He is pure act. And so this is the sort of theism where God is existence itself, where God is not a thing. Right? So in the Neoplatonist tradition, someone like David Bentley Hart, maybe people know who he is, Orthodox theologian. He calls, following like the Neoplatonic tradition, he calls God a no thing. God a no thing, right? So it kind of sounds like controversial, nothing. Right? Yeah. God is nothing, right? But Father Brian Davis, a famous Thomist scholar, especially does a lot of defense of Thomas Aquinas' philosophical thought. He's within the Catholic tradition. He likewise, right? God's not a thing. He's not a being like you and I. He is being itself, right? We might say that God's a person or personal, but all these words are just going to be applied to God differently than they are going to be applied to you and I, right? So part of, there's a lot of key figures who would stand within this tradition that I'm sure you know. But so this is the sort of theism that I have in mind when I say that classical theism is consistent with Buddhism. This is kind of this is the sort of picture of what I have in mind.
Yeah. Okay. So for those people out there that are like, maybe feel like a little bit lost, classical theism is probably if you just grew up in sort of Orthodox Christianity in America, you probably were more privy to classical theism than this theistic personalism, right? And that theistic personalism tends to start opening doors to things like open theism, process theology, right? Where like God is sort of evolving, or you can change God's mind, that kind of thing, right? I mean, I know I'm simplifying, or I'm picking like one piece of it. But
that's right, yeah. So if you grew up in sort of low church traditions, or sort of just general evangelical traditions, probably you've been presented God as this much more of this personalistic sort of understanding, in which you're absolutely right. This does oftentimes sort of situate the open theism debate a lot better. But if you grew up in a Catholic tradition, perhaps some of the higher Reformed traditions, you would understand. Perhaps if you were catechized and so forth, you would maybe this classical theistic God would sound a bit more familiar to you as well. The main thing, though, I think to get across is that theistic personalists want to say that God is like a maximally great person.
Yes,
he's a maximally great mind. He's in the same category as you and I, insofar as persons. He's just maximally great and our creator, and all that sort of stuff. While the classical theist is going to want to say, no, like there are no words, which we can understand God sort of univocally, right? What philosophers call univocal understanding of God. How we understand God is going to be much more mysterious, right? It's going to be by way of analogy, not by univocal predications.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
anyway,
so do you think these are two equally valid ways to understand God, or do you think one is total trash and one is a total treasure? Where do you stand? Tell me what I should believe.
Right. You should believe
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you should repent and submit to the Pontiff of Rome. Right now, joking, kind of. JK, kind of. Yeah, I'm a classical theist, obviously, because that's the Catholic tradition. I've defended. So recently, I co-wrote a paper defending how classical theism fits well with what we know about cognitive science. This book will have 2 chapters defending classical theism. So I'm interested in defending classical theism, being a classical theist, and so forth. I like Aquinas and Aristotle and so forth. So I guess I would be on team classical theist. But here's the interesting thing about the project. You don't have to be a classical theist to think the project is helpful, right?
Yeah.
Because you can be a neoclassical theist and think, okay, God, I deny classical theism, but nonetheless, I'd rather someone who was a Buddhist be a classical theist than no theist at all, right?
Of course.
And so when you're talking it up with a your Buddhist friend, right? You can say, well, hey, there is this conception of God. I don't necessarily endorse it, but hey, maybe this is kind of consistent with some of your claims.
So when I was in seminary taking like theology 101 kind of, I actually took it with Wayne Grudem, and he talked about the communicable and incommunicable attributes of God, which makes me think kind of the parts that you were talking about. But it was my understanding that's just how we can understand God. Those are kind of words that our simple minds can understand.
Right.
God is not as, he can't be reduced to he's this, he's this, he's this. But those are ways that we can help we can learn more about who he is by understanding he's creative, he's whatever.
We can apply, like, for example, like the word good to God in the same way we apply it to us. When I say Sarah is good, usually that means like Sarah, she follows God, or she does her moral duties. She helps out people who
I pay my
need
taxes
it.
And I love my kids. Yeah.
And there's a standard called good that we're judging Sarah by right now, right? Well, God and classical theism is identical to goodness itself.
Right.
There is no standard outside of God in which we can judge God's actions. Moreover, God doesn't have any moral duties. Right?
Yeah.
So the word good can't be applied univocally in the same exact way. And so while we don't want to say that the word good for God is something radically different that we have no idea,
Sure.
Nonetheless, somewhere in the middle, right? And that's what philosophers call analogical. So these are we understand God by way of analogy.
Yeah. It's fascinating. We're not going to spend the rest of the time on that, but we had to at least cover that so that when you say words like classical theism, people know what you're talking about. But okay, so walk us through, this whole podcast is only an hour, but walk us through kind of the basics, the core teachings of Buddhism.
Okay.
If, I'm a 6-year-old and I've never heard of Buddhism before. What is Buddhism?
Was it Michael Scott quote? Explain this to me like I'm 5.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. So when you're talking about Buddhism, there's obviously the 4 noble truths that we can get into. But
knew is that there was some number in there. I conflated it with Islam that has the 5. Okay. 4 noble.
But I find helpful, looking at contemporary Buddhist philosophers, right, and kind of reading them and seeing how they summarize their own faith, right. So there's a Buddhist philosopher named Jay Garfield, right? And he's really good. He has a book called Engaging Buddhism, which I highly recommend, especially if you have some familiarity with philosophy. His book is quite helpful. But so he phrases it like this: that there is suffering in this world, right? and that suffering in this world is caused by confusion about ultimate reality, what ultimately exists. Right? And that suffering, that confusion, comes from how reality is actually metaphysically different than what we think. So the two most important metaphysical theses of Buddhism that I take is to be that all phenomena are impermanent, all things are impermanent, all objects are impermanent, whatever word you want to use. And all things are interdependent. And because of this, and we'll discuss exactly what that is. Because of this, all things are empty of an intrinsic nature. Things lack an intrinsic nature. So we'll get into this. But in just shortly summarizing the core tenets of Buddhism here from Garfield, he argues that fundamental confusion takes place right at the phenomena level. So we think that things are permanent, independent, and things have their own intrinsic nature. And so
when you say their own intrinsic nature, what do you mean? Like I have my Diet Coke here, and I think it's made of like syrup and carbonated water. And what do you mean when you say it doesn't have an intrinsic nature?
So we'll get into that just one second. I'll finish summarizing the view. No. It's fine. And then I'll get into what I mean by interdependence and impermanence and so on.
Okay.
The idea again being ultimate reality. Things are changing, right? Things are mutable. Things are impermanent. Things are interdependent. All things depend on each other, conceptually, causally. We'll get into it. And so our minds, though, they don't realize that. They think reality is ultimately where things are permanent, where things are independent, right? Where things exist independently from other objects and conceptions and so forth. And so we can eliminate the pain that's caused by this. Right? We can eliminate the pain that's caused by the lack of realization that all things are impermanent and interdependent. And having and I quote Garfield, an ethically appropriate orientation to the world, characterized by a cultivation, an attitude of rejoicing in the welfare and goodness of others, beneficence towards others, and especially commitment to the active welfare of sentient beings. So we need to reorient our minds and have regarding the right realization. Right, we need to reorient our minds, realize that things are interdependent and impermanent, and things lack intrinsic nature, and we need to ethically appropriately behave in such a manner, right? And this is how we will reduce suffering. So this is the solution for reducing suffering. This, I take it to be sort of the core, right, of the mere teachings of Buddhism. If you want to follow C.S. Lewis, right, and call it mere Buddhism, right, instead of mere Christianity.
Right.
Now I can go ahead and get into what exactly the key bit of what I've just described that's going to be in conflict with theism is not that there's suffering in the world, right? Sure. Obviously, there's plenty of that. Christians will say that, right? Yeah. It's not that we can reduce suffering from a right realization about reality, about ultimately what is, or that we, following an ethical path that corresponds with how ultimate reality is, right? Yeah, that can reduce suffering, sure, no problem, right? As Christians and thinking that's the case, or as theists thinking that's the case. However, right, the key thing there is going to be accepting the interdependence thesis and the impermanence thesis. And so by impermanence thesis, I mean the thesis that that all things are changing, right? All things are constantly changing. So they have this like radical view here where if anyone's familiar with the Leibniz's law of identity, it's sort of a radical version of that, where if there's any subtle, small change, right, in an object, then that's a new object. Then it's not the same object as it was before. And obviously, things are constantly changing, right? Things are losing the property of existing at 11:38 at night. Mm-hmm. And then I'll gain the property of, being at 11:39 at night, right?
This is like the you never step in the same river twice kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. So, it's the idea is that things are radically impermanent.
Okay.
And so we're attaching ourselves to things that we think are permanent. Like we're desiring, like, man, it would be really great if I could have like $1 billion right now. Or it would really be great if I could get that car or that PlayStation 5 or that, whatever. It'd be really great. And we're acting as if these objects have permanence, right? And in fact, right, it's these objects are in constant flux. It's not the same object as it was yesterday, as it will be today and will be tomorrow, right? So that's the impermanence thesis, that all things are impermanent, right? The interdependent thesis, is the standard formulation of it is when this arises, that arises. When this does not occur, that does not occur. Right? A more technical understanding, David Burton, Buddhist philosopher, I think he's a Buddhist philosopher. He at least publishes in Buddhist philosophy. He says, all entities have a dependently arisen and conceptually constructed existence. So everything is conceptually and causally connected together, right? Kind of one organic whole, right? Everything is dependent on one another. And so, we're acting like that things are permanent, that things are independent of themselves, like they're objects that have intrinsic nature. And so what we mean, what we can talk about when we're talking about intrinsic nature is that that there is sort of an independent identity of that object that it has it within its own being, right? That its identity is within itself and its own inherent existence. It has that identity inherent in itself, and it doesn't depend on anything else, conceptually, causally, etc., for its identity. Right?
Can you give us an example so that we take this out of the realm of philosophy and into like pick an object or pick a thing or a person or something and kind of walk us through what it would look like if it was independent or not?
Yeah. So let's talk about, let's say a man who lost his wife, right? Okay. Maybe she, died of something, right? She got in a car accident or something. What was his wife, right? His wife was, he understands her as having sort of, as having had inherent existence, right? Where she wasn't causally dependent on anything else for her own existence. But in reality, her existence, even when she was alive, was dependent on others, right?
Sure.
Kind of like the butterfly effect. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So
I've seen the Ashton Kutcher movie, so I'm basically
exactly
an expert. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the idea is something like, she depends on her dad and mom for her existence, and they depend on others, and they depend on others, and not only biologically is there dependence, but she's connected to people who give her parents money, right, for his work or the job her dad does.
Sure. And the food she puts in her body and all those things. Yeah.
So everything is connected to her. She depends on everything else. She depends on the collective whole, so to speak. And in a sense, she still is connected to the husband. So the grieving husband, right? He wants his wife, but in a sense, he still is connected to her causally, right? And even his own identity and how it morphs and so forth. So even that, it's something that's supposed to bring, in a world of constant flux and constant change, it's supposed to bring some sort of calmness and some sort of serenity, knowing that no matter what happens, I will always be connected, right, with my loved one.
Now, that's interesting that you chose an example, and maybe you'll regret choosing this example after I say this, I don't know, but where he can sort of still be connected because she's still dependent on all these outside pieces. Because isn't one of the big things about Buddhism, and it's one of the big things that would keep me from being Buddhist, is this idea of detachment, that we're constantly supposed to be detaching ourselves from people and things and relationships and that kind of thing. So he shouldn't want to hold on to her, right?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about here, right? So it's not in Buddhism to say that we should just not strive for right realization, right? It's sometimes in evangelical circles, if you might hear well, hey, you shouldn't desire anything. Well, guess what? That means you shouldn't desire not to desire, right? And that's not what's meant by desire, right? The idea is that we have wrong orientation. We see the world wrongly. We see the world as if it is as it is impermanent and dependent, that there is intrinsic identity in all things. And we're desiring these things as such. But we need to recognize that these things aren't permanent, that they aren't independent, and we need to stop desiring them as such, right? So for this case, and also understanding that the radical impermanence thesis would be applied here as well. So his wife, the sort of slice of her that exists at last before what we would call she passed, right? That was technically a sort of a different slice than the slice that existed a second before that, and before that, and before that, and before that. And so it's sort of helping you, right? You're not attaching to yourself to someone who is in continual existence for some particular time.
As you understand those things, it changes attachment because you're not attached. Right. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. I got it. All right. I'm going to move us along for the sake of those that are okay, got it. Impermanence and interdependence. Okay. So if someone gets on board with that you need to be constantly trying to think differently about these things, that will reduce suffering. How does that take us to theism? How does that help?
Yeah. So, first off, just to be clear, to clarify my own position, I don't find the metaphysics of Buddhism plausible. Right. So I follow a philosopher named Thomas Reid, who's a common sense epistemologist. Basically, what seems obvious to you, right? You should believe that unless you have damn good reason to reject that sort of view. Yeah. And so it really seems to me that my wife is that she exists, and it's she doesn't go out existence every second. She's the same one today as she was yesterday, and she'll be the same person the day before or the day later. So I don't find that helpful because I don't think that it's accurate. Right? Yeah. But for my Buddhist friends who do, so I have a good friend here in Macau, and he's a Buddhist philosopher, and he's interested in Christianity, right? And whether or not there's synthesis between the two, right? Yeah. And it's not uncommon. I've had friends in the past who were Buddhists for some particular period of time, and they were philosophers, and thought that they had to be either Buddhist or theist, or they had to be Buddhist or Christian, right? They couldn't have it both ways, and so they were like, I guess I'll just go the Buddhist route, though. Right. That's the one I'm a little bit more confident in, so I'll just go the Buddhist way.
I can't save you. Why would you choose that one? Anyway, continue. Yeah.
And so this sort of project is supposed to go, okay, wait a minute. If you're a theist, or you want to be a theist, but you also want to endorse what I call mere Buddhism.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of other different metaphysical doctrines and other things that might come with various different traditions in Buddhism.
Sure.
But this is what I'm just calling the sort of mere basic Buddhism, right?
Okay.
That I want to be able to say that you can do both. While in the book, we don't say you can be a Christian and be a Buddhist, because I'm not a theologian, right? So I'll leave that to my theologian friends. But we think we're making headway, at least, if we can say that you can be a theist.
Yeah.
And be a Buddhist. Okay. So you might say something like, well, how can you be a Buddhist and a theist, right?
I see now where the classical theism thing comes in. Okay.
Yes.
It's clicking.
We just said that all things, all objects, right, are impermanent and interdependent. God's supposed to be permanent, though, right? God's supposed to be independent of all things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're saying that God is constantly changing, such that now we're talking about like God 1, God 2, God 3.
Sure, sure, infinite.
And then we're talking about not only a God who's not existing permanently, but a God who's dependent on all of his creation. And now we really are getting into some more process theology stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you might think that theism's not compatible with that then. Right? And so classical theism, however, said God's not an object. God's not a thing. So the impermanence and interdependence theses don't apply to God. Right. They only apply to things, to object, to phenomena.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I dig this. I like it. So talk a little bit about, you said you were just talking about mere Buddhism. And so we're not getting into a lot of the stuff that people think about. But you did tell me we could talk about karma. Talk a little bit about what karma is, maybe how Buddhists think of karma, and how that works into this conversation. Can Christians believe in karma? By the way, just my own personal caveat here. It seems to me that most Americans, even a lot of Christians, believe in karma. They might not say those words, but they act as if it's true. Right. And there's a little bit of it in this biblical idea, you reap what you sow, do unto others as you would have them do unto you kind of thing. And I think so many people think, well, I've put good stuff out there. I deserve good stuff back. And so then when it doesn't happen that way, it's like, well, this isn't fair. This isn't how it's supposed to be. So I think a lot of people believe in karma, whether they say it or not. But anyway, I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah. So where karma comes into play. So in the book, basically we say, okay, how can we understand human identity and human judgment? Because obviously humans are things, and they would be constantly changing. And we'd have different slice. Tyler would be like this particular Tyler slice that exists at T1, T2, T3, etc. And so we actually utilize the work of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards actually, and I know you have some Reformed followers. In fact, Sarah, I know you're Reformed.
Why does everyone that comes on this show want to out me as being Reformed? Yes, I am Reformed. So is Evan, by the way. I'm not alone. Continue.
At least he's a Lutheran, though.
Yeah. But he's a bad Lutheran in that way, I think. Another podcast, another day. We'll jump in that river another time.
And I haven't read nearly enough Jonathan Edwards to really be considered
That's
Reformed.
True.
So
okay.
So Jonathan Edwards actually affirms impermanence theses, right? And so we talk about how does Jonathan Edwards then understand human identity, right? And so we just kind of use him to make sense of how God can still judge us and how we can still have some, at least really weak sense of identity using the works of Jonathan Edwards and so forth. And then we kind of go through and we say, okay, what other sort of objections might one have, right? From this sort of Christian or Muslim or Jewish perspective when it comes to Buddhism. And so that is where the karma bit comes up. And there's two different ways to understand karma. There is this kind of more robust metaphysical way, like this much more theological, robust ontology sort of way, and then a much more naturalistic or reductive way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we're most familiar with in popular culture, right, is the much more ontologically heavy version where, there's in some sense, somewhere, some cosmic scale
Yes.
that is taking into account all of our good actions and all of our bad actions, right? And there's a sort of a cosmic response to that. And so, what we do, the good things will lead us toward enlightenment and perhaps to better reincarnation paths in the future, right? And obviously, bad karma will prevent this, right? Put us at a worse spot for enlightenment, and so forth. But then there is a much more naturalistic way of understanding it. And that's just how whenever I sort of put something bad into the universe, guess what? We're all connected together.
Right.
And so I'm harming us. I'm harming all of us. And if I'm harming all of us, I'm harming myself. And I'm harming my own way of enlightenment, right? To get the right realization about reality. And so, but the more good that I put in to the universe, the more I help people, I'm really helping myself and my own route to enlightenment.
Okay.
So if that's just all what you mean by karma, well, then I don't think there's any sort of doctrine in Christianity or Islam or Judaism that's going to think that that's, objectable. I mean, maybe the first sort of understanding, but not the second.
Sure. I think you could, if you're with someone that's thinking very philosophically, you could object to it in the sense that, can we do anything good? Like, is there good, outside of God, kind of, but we already have we had David Baggett on a couple weeks ago, so we'll just refer people back to that podcast about goodness and morality. But okay, I get what you're saying there. Yeah. I mean, that's just sort of common sense. Like if I do a bad thing, it's bad for me and it's bad for others, and vice versa. If I help,
and it's going to prevent you from realizing reality and how it ultimately really is, and it's that is going to cause you to suffer more, according to Buddhism.
Well, it's like the disordered thinking? That Augustine disordered. What is it? Disordered desires is kind of Augustine's thing, right? Like you can skew yourself, by doing those things. Okay. Do you have any questions before? I don't want to just take over.
Well, can I just say one thing real quick?
Yeah.
Right before your question. Sorry, I was trying to find this earlier. There's a really good quote from the philosopher Father Davis in reference to speaking about Catherine of Siena and Jonathan Edwards. He has this really great quote I wanted to mention. God is ultimate reality, and Catherine of Siena, whose thinking is governed by the notion of God as source of everything, repeatedly says that only God is, and she herself is not. In a similar vein, Edwards explains that creatures are, in a sense, empty. By creatures being thus wholly and universally dependent on God, writes Edwards, it appears that the creature is nothing and that God is all. And so again, the idea of emptiness, right, in Buddhism, this because of the dependence thesis, this fits really well with that. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that in since we brought up reform stuff. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Time in.
Well, I had a number of maybe random thoughts, but let me just kind of try to make sure I understand the thesis, because if I'm a little lost, then other people might be a little lost. Okay. Sure. So the basic thesis is that sort of mere Buddhism would suggest that there are two key realities. One is that all things are not permanent and all things are interdependent. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we could sort of, even though we would not accept that on its face as sort of, Orthodox Christians, but we could say that God is sort of outside of the category because God is not a thing, right? So all things are not permanent. Okay, fine. All things are interdependent. Okay, fine. But God is not a thing. So therefore so would this be kind of the first step of, say, converting, if you will, or bringing the gospel to a Buddhism, is first to say, oh yeah. We can go along with that. We'll put that on the back burner for now, but understand that God is not a thing. So is that kind of the first step? Because yes. You're okay. So there's clarity there. Okay. Now, so a couple of big questions on sort of the Western experience with day-to-day Buddhism would be something like, is Buddhism even theistic? I think that would be question number one. Do they even have a God? And then again, in terms of our particular Western experience of Buddhism, which is pretty shallow, I think it's safe to say, like, oh, I read, Fixing Motorcycles and the Art of Zen Buddhism, whatever that is, right? For a lot of people in the West, Buddhism seems to be kind of an escape valve, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I mean, I've met a lot of people who are like, well, I'm Buddhist. And I'm like, no, you're not. Give me a break. Like, when was the last time you went to the temple? Okay. People just say that because they don't want to admit that they're actually an atheist, but they want to claim some higher moral ground. So,
or they like to meditate, or they believe there's sort of this yin and yang kind of, I mean, I think there's a few things they've picked that they like.
Sure. Like cafeteria style, but like, are they actually like, so one question would be, to sum it up, would be, can a rich person be a Buddhist? Right. Because if the point is like detachment, aren't wealthy people really just having their cake and eating it too, or how do they get around that? So just as a rhetorical point, like if you're actually a Buddhist, doesn't it require certain disciplines that seem to not be common in the West? But to bring it back to the kind of where I veered off here, like without maybe trying to explain to a Buddhism what classical theism is, like as we encounter it on a day-to-day basis, is there kind of an argument about whether God even exists within Buddhism? Is that a place to sort of start? Like, how would you go about talking to someone who says they're a Buddhist if we wanted to kind of start to get them to question whether that's actually the case or not?
Right. Well, of course, you can just ask them what they mean by that, right? Just see where they're coming from. And then if they're not very forthcoming with the information, then you can say, well, as I understand Buddhism, right? Buddhism asserts these theses, right? Interdependence and impermanence, and so is that what you believe, right? And go from there, right? And it's like, oh yeah, that's what I believe. It's exactly what I believe. And then you can say, well, I think these theses are actually consistent with belief in God. And then you could explain. I mean, so many people don't understand classically how theism has been defined, right, by the great historic confessions, whether they be Reformed or Catholic, right? And so, just starting off with like, this is what I mean by God, right? I mean by God, pure actuality, right? And you explain what that is, right? Maybe you give them the first ways to help explain that, elucidate that. And then see where they are. I mean, are they now open to theism? Well, if so, now say, okay, well, if God does exist, what do we do with the resurrection? And then you can get into historical evidence, right? Mike Lacona, N.T. Wright,
sure.
William Lane Craig stuff. In fact, in the book, the last chapter, the second chapter on pluralism that we address, we, in response to a pluralist philosopher named John Hick, we defend the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. Also the miracle of Fatima, but we don't need to get into those details here. But so I mean, obviously the idea, if you read the book, you're going to get this idea that that this is a resource to help bring. If you're a Christian, at least you'll know this is a resource to help bring people closer to Christian discussion, Christian dialogue, Christian faith. And so that's, I guess, how I would handle someone telling me I'm a Buddhist, and that's how it is. Yeah. Definitely starting off with just hammering on what is God. I think that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, then in that case, my hope would be that I do encounter a sincere Buddhist,
right,
and not a lazy, wealthy Westerner, right, who wants to be able to claim some kind of moral standard for themselves because it would be totally gauche to be an atheist, right? And so they adopt cafeteria style, like Buddhist principles, and so in that case, I would hope that I would meet sincere Buddhists, right?
Yeah.
Like, so that I could actually dialogue at that level.
Well, that kind of gets to my next question, which is the reverse. So I love the idea of talking to a Buddhist and seeing if there's a way to move from there to theism and then eventually even to Christianity. That's amazing. Moving the other direction, my question is, I have several friends who are Christians or claim to be Christians and will like go to Buddhist retreats, silent meditation retreats, or they will have things in their home that are like Buddhist sayings, or they'll meditate every day and not meditate on scripture, right? Like, and so there's kind of this Eastern mystical like ways that some of the Buddhist teachings and ideas are coming in. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a danger there, and like where's the bridge too far? Like, is it okay to I don't know, like go eat at a Chinese restaurant that has a little Buddha when you walk in, but it's not okay to go to a retreat where I read Siddhartha when I was in like 9th grade. And all I remember from the book is that Siddhartha is that's Buddhism, right?
Yes.
Okay. That's like the original Buddha or something. That is Siddhartha. Anyway, all I remember from the book is that he goes off and he has a lot of time being quiet, which sounds awful to me because I do love noise and to talk and all of that, but it doesn't sound like it's particularly wrong, So I guess my question is there a danger to trying to have all of that and do all of those things? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I want to say, and this is where my alliance with my Reformed brothers and sisters might cut off here.
It's okay. We can still be friends even if you're wrong.
Specifically, part of my understanding about this has been informed by Vatican II, right? Catholic Ecumenical Dogmatic Council, where I want to say that all truth is God's truth.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
And truths found in other religions and practices found in other religions and cultures, if they're true and good, then they're holy and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I am typically a bit more optimistic about, I think there's oftentimes, even within Hinduism and other religious traditions, a lot more that's beautiful and true and good in the religious traditions than, say, a standard evangelical approach where, at least how I was as an evangelical, how I was taught and saw the world was, they're completely and utterly wrong, show them how they're false and bring them to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd be in trouble. I live in China. I'd be in trouble if I had to leave any place that had a Buddhist statue. Couldn't go in any taxi or restaurant.
That was mostly to be tongue in cheek. I'm not going to stop eating getting my nails done there. Yeah.
I'd be hungry. So if you go to a Buddhist temple, I don't see anything wrong with that. If you pray to God, the God of classical theism, I don't see anything wrong with that. If you do an act of, if you're starting to meditate and just you believe in the metaphysics that ultimate reality is God. God is ultimate reality. I in a sense am not. He is in a sense something, right? So at a Buddhist retreat, you're focusing on this, you're thinking about this, right? I can't see anything that's wrong with that. Now, as for offering up incense to bodhvas, or offering up incense to acts of worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that's obviously where I have an issue with, and I would encourage my friends not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, well, what if the Buddhist wants to still do that, right? And believe in Christianity too? And I think that's where I'm not comfortable talking about, because I'm not a theologian, and especially I'm not a Catholic theologian where I have all knowledge of canon law and so forth, and can systematically kind of give a nice answer for this. So as a philosopher, I'll go back to my sort of little cave, and I'll just say, well, this is what mere Buddhism is, and this is what classical theism is. Then they seem consistent, the end.
Well, and you don't at that point have to be a theologian. You just have to know your Bible and be able to say things like, well, it seems like Jesus was saying that he is the only way, and go from there. But that's not my intention to get into the nitty gritty of that kind of thing. I think I have thought of, so I think Buddhism has a strong, its fingers strongly in Western thought, religion, faith, so much so that sometimes people don't even realize that there's kind of some of these Eastern, and something being Eastern doesn't make it wrong and bad, right? But when you start talking about religion and this sort of Eastern mysticism that I think creeps in, to me, the danger, and I'm curious if you think this is true or not, is that the focus starts to go inside rather than outside, within rather than without, right? Christians believe that salvation comes from without. Like, we need God to rescue us, right? There's a rift between us and God, and we need Jesus' work on the cross to save us. And so when we pray to someone outside of us. When we cry out for help, we cry out to somebody outside of us. And when we meditate on something outside of us or about something outside of us. And it seems to me that Buddhism and some of the mysticism that comes along with that has you looking inward to those things, inward to some sort of inner divine spark, your own self being kind of God. I don't know if that's actual Buddhism or the way that it's sort of been bastardized by people that just want to be like mystical. Thoughts on that?
I think that's more of like a bastardized version.
Okay.
In the Mahayana tradition, grace is like heavily emphasized, and also within Buddhist traditions that have been highly influenced in Japan, grace is highly emphasized. We need grace, and
From
we need
where?
Maybe someone who's reached enlightenment, but still sort of not fully becoming, not fully entering that until all are saved, until so we can ask for their merit or their enlightenment, and we can that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
As for just sort of seeing Jesus as the way, the truth, the life, no one coming to the Father but through him, and seeing in Acts, right? And no other name is anyone saved but the name of Jesus Christ. Firmly believe that, right?
Yeah.
Catholics firmly believe this.
Yeah.
However, we will differ probably here in that I think that Buddhists can be trusting in Christ without realizing it, believing in Christ without realizing it. If they don't know the Christianity, yes. So if they don't know if Christianity is true, they don't know the church is true, but they are trusting in the truth they have. Jesus is the truth. They're trusting in Christ without realizing it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a possibility that many Buddhists are saved and reaching enlightenment and so forth. But obviously, as my job as a Christian is to make, even if they are somehow mysteriously in union with Christ, my job as a Christian is to still proclaim Christ in hopes that they would be more robustly tied to Jesus,
right?
And experience the fullness of what it means to be union with Christ and his holy church.
Yeah, I like it. We are kind of out of time, and it's very late for you. It's the next day for you. It's Sunday.
Yes,
for you.
That's correct.
Any final thoughts you want to? I didn't even get to 7 of my questions here, but any other final thoughts you want to give, or what is the name of the book so that when it does come out in February, people can look for it?
Yeah. So the name is Classical Theism and Buddhism. You're going to make me forget the subtitle. Hold on.
I'm going to make you. Now you
something like a synthesis of ethical and it's something like a synthesis of ethical and soteriological systems, something like, or connecting ethical and soteriological systems, something like this.
We can search your name on Amazon, right?
Amazon, right? Classical Theism and Buddhism will come up, right? That's the name of that's the main title of the book.
Okay. So. Okay. And if people want to send you hate mail about being, kind of like low-key universalist, I'm joking. But where can people find you if they do want to?
I don't think universalism is true, though. I do hope it is true. But
doesn't everyone? I mean, this is my beef about when people are like, I'm a hopeful universalist. I'm like, so you're a human? Like, we would all love that. Right.
Well, I think there is a possibility, even if I'm very skeptical of it being a genuine possibility. But you can email me at SARAHMA.
That's my email. What a silly person Tyler is.
If one wants to send hate mail, you can send that. Other emails.
Oh, I'm already getting hate mail. Don't worry.
You can Tyler.McNabb at usj.edu.mo.
Ooh, fancy. Okay. Or find him on Facebook or some Google his name and harass him in whatever way you want to. And then, of course, if you want to know more about Theology on Tap and all the stuff we have going on, you can find everything you need to know about life, salvation. No, I'm kidding. But just about us at HoustonTOT.com. I have a feeling this podcast is coming out right after our February event, but we have events every other month. And if you come to them, you get to vote on the topic for the next one. So come use your democratic voice. And by the time this podcast comes out, I believe the book will be out or coming out soon. When's it coming out?
Comes out 2 days after.
Okay, perfect.
So it's just in time to order it on Amazon and get that 2-day shipping and get it there. Yeah.
2-day shipping, please. I'm a same day Prime member. 2-day shipping is like a pioneer. Okay. Anyway, thank you, Tyler, for joining us today. I'm going to let you go sleep now. And thank you all for joining us, listening. As usual, subscribe and like us and review us and rate us and give us all your adoration and adulation. But until we see you next, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.